Adoption pathway chosen. Prior legal adoption. The CEO legally adopted Camila years before his final decline. Their bond deepened afterward. He was a man who had everything the world measures: towers with his name on their facades, a portrait in the company lobby, private jets and a calendar so tight assistants scheduled his breath. Yet in the pale hush of an intensive care room, beneath the blinking rhythm of machines, the single thing he sought was a hand to hold. Alexander Royce's fingers, thin with age and illness, closed around a smaller, warm hand, the hand of the woman who had once been a nurse for hire and, years earlier, he had chosen to call his daughter. The monitor made a steady, indifferent sound. Alexander's voice came out small and animal, as if the muscles that had commanded boardrooms could only manage a whisper now. "Camila," he breathed. Her name was a hook that pulled him back to coherence and then let him drift again. In the corridor beyond the glass, the city continued, indifferent to the tapering of a private life. Inside, everything narrowed to a single line between two people and a single request yet to be spoken. He had not expected the tenderness. In a life built on plans and projections, relationships had always felt like variables to be optimized. Camila, steady, plain-spoken, with no interest in the trappings he'd spent a lifetime pursuing, entered his room and did what she'd always done without sentiment. She set his pillow right, tucked the thin hospital blanket up to his collarbone, and kept watch without making a show of it. Under the fluorescence, all of Alexander's accomplishments folded into an ache that no balance sheet could touch. If this story matters to you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that people can change. He remembered the day he collapsed with the strange clarity of someone watching a replay of a life-altering film. The boardroom had been glass and chrome, as cold and glittering as a safe deposit box. He had been up for days, running numbers, cutting through hesitation with the blunt tool of authority. The last call he took had been on speakerphone while he walked past the model of a new development, his thumb tracing the miniature streets. He liked to believe he built cities. What he rarely considered was how people were scaffolding the parts of those cities he never needed to visit. It was late afternoon. The marble lobby below swallowed the heels of the people who came to see him. A security guard, standing like a distant sentinel, told the paramedics later that Alexander simply went still, his face paling as if someone had taken color from him. When they wheeled him out, the morning paper photographers craned necks, but the real press of life was in the stretcher. Cold hands, bright lights in his face, the small sound of a monitor that someone tuned into rhythm and panic. It was, by Alexander's private reckoning, an exhaustion so absolute the body shut down to force reflection. Camila was one of the nurses on duty that night. She had come to the hospital the way she came to most places, on time, with a practical bag slung over her shoulder. Pockets that held small things people needed and never asked for. An extra pair of socks, a band-aid, a pen. She had a habit, when offered coffee, of taking it black and strong, as if she wanted the solidity of bitterness to anchor the longer shifts. She had names she answered to, and she had a mother, Zelia, who scrubbed building hallways and who watched the world the way people who sweep floors tend to watch, with a knowledge of foot traffic and the tiny items people leave behind. History in a city of development has a way of claiming lives quietly. Years before Alexander's collapse, a man named Roberto, Zelia's brother-in-law, had died in a scaffolding accident on a construction site that carried Alexander's company logo. The company filed a settlement. There had been legal language and envelopes moved across desks. For some, it was a line item. For Zelia, it was a son gone and a family left to navigate the arid aftermath. She had pushed through the days with pride and a silence that did not need answers. She would speak of her grief to no one unless she had to. When Camila first walked into Alexander's room, she was efficient and unflappable. He was unconscious, a territory she had navigated dozens of times before, watchful for oxygenation, for signs of infection, for the small betrayals of the human body. She adjusted a drip, smoothed his sheets, and when the agency nurse on charge called a family number, Camila answered instead of waiting for a social worker. She spoke with the calm of someone who has learned that panic does not solve anything and steady hands often do. The first night Alexander opened his eyes, confusion clouded them like fog. He mouthed words that were half memory, names he had not spoken for a long time, a voice calling for the wrong time. Then, more stable than the rest, the single name he kept returning to, Camila. The nurses smiled at the oddity of an old man calling for a young nurse, as if she were a lighthouse in the fog. Camila felt a jolt that was not entirely professional. In that moment, between the beeps and the soft tangle of fluorescent light, she saw a man with 1,000 rooms and not a single inhabitant who knew his quiet. Their early exchanges were practical. Alexander asked little, but the questions he did ask cut to the structure of things. How long? Will I be able to work? Who's running my day? Camila answered with a nurse's candor, but she never treated him like another patient in a ledger. She read his discomfort where others saw only a project to be optimized. When he was discharged, the city expected him to slide back into his old rhythms. The boardroom would wait, the company would hum on. But something had shifted. The collapse had peeled away a layer of armor. He woke every morning with a memory of being small and fragile, and, for the first time, he noticed the people who made the company run, not just the executives who sat across from him, but the janitors, the clerks, the workers who ate lunch in plastic containers by the scaffolding, the faces that never made it into press releases. Camila returned to her job, not thinking at first that she had altered the course of a man's life. But she found herself answering calls from Alexander's private line more often than she expected. He began to ask for her in the language the wealthy use for favors, direct, unapologetic, then softened to ask for company in the evenings when insomnia gnawed at his joints. She took the calls, at first out of duty, then because she noticed the way he listened when she spoke of small things. How her mother's hands smelled of lemon when she scrubbed the floors, how her younger cousin Matteo had drawn an enormous dinosaur that took up an entire sheet of school paper. He listened in a way he had not listened to investors and analysts, presence without an agenda. It was during a box of paperwork he had not expected to open that Alexander found a file that made the marble in his lobby feel suddenly colder. The file contained the name of the worker who had died, the company's settlement ledger, and a crisp note that read like a ledger entry rather than a life. Settlement processed. There was no flourish of compassion, only the prose of efficiency. He read Roberto's name, Zelia's man, and felt his chest tighten as if someone had squeezed it. Memory and responsibility collided in him with a bluntness he could not ignore. He confronted the execs with a tone that surprised even his closest advisers. Where they wanted to bury the matter, keep it handled and out of the court of public feeling, he wanted acknowledgement. The words formal apology and pension began to circulate under his name. He did not want a press conference. He wanted to make things right in a manner that could be traced and verified, not only in the ledger, but in the lives affected. The first thing he did was pick up the phone and ask to see Zelia in person. The office where he asked for her was not the glass facade seen in photographs, but a small room at the company's community outreach center, furnished plainly at his insistence. He did not bring reporters. That was an important line he drew. He sat across from her, and his apology was not a stylized speech, but a stammering thing that meant more for its honesty than for its polish. "We made mistakes," he said. "We treated your brother-in-law as a number. That was wrong. I want to try and make it right." Zelia accepted his apology the way she accepted rain, Because it came, and because it mattered for the crops it could nourish, not for the way it made her look. They spoke for a long hour about the days after Roberto's death, the months of paperwork, the way grief had a bureaucratic weight that no amount of money could lift. Alexander listened, and, for the first time, did not look for an angle. He heard the quiet fury beneath Zelia's dignity, and it changed him slowly, like frost working into a river that once ran hard and unyielding. He did not make grand pronouncements to the world. Instead, he set in motion a series of practical steps: pensions for families of workers who had been injured or killed, a community fund to support education and retraining in neighborhoods impacted by his company's developments, a program that paid for safety audits on all active sites and made compliance independent of profit margins. He restructured incentives so project managers had to prove that safety and community benefits were in place before a project could be greenlit. The changes were not instantaneous pardons. They were bureaucratic mechanisms, slow to build and resistant to sabotage. His board resisted. They called him naive. His mother, Marlene, called him sentimental and worried aloud about the cost to the family name. His brother, Raphael, grumbled about markets and shareholders. Alexander ignored the noise because what he was doing required a kind of stubbornness that money alone had never bought him before: humility. He appointed Camila to a role that was equal parts liaison and conscience, a position that had been created in part because he trusted her judgment and in part because he wanted someone who remembered what being unseen felt like. Camila did the job with a seriousness that made others underestimate her at first. She came from the world of nurse shifts and hospital corridors, not boardrooms. Her mother watched with a mix of awe and protective suspicion as her daughter began to occupy spaces that were not designed for people like them. But Camila had a way of translating empathy into structures. She insisted on listening tours before program launches. She refused to accept token gestures of charity, and she refused to let the fund be another instrument of PR. She insisted the money be managed transparently, with community-elected trustees, and she insisted on safety measures that would protect the laborers who did the actually dangerous work of building the company's skyline. The scene where Alexander formalized what strangers would later call a strange thing, a billionaire legally adopting a woman half his age, was modest and private. There was a small ceremony at a courthouse, 2 signatures, a notary stamp, and no press. For him, it was a way to make a bond into a responsibility. For her, it was recognition, not rescue. She did not need a name change or a proclamation. She needed a promise that what she had asked for, attention, agency, accountability, would survive him if he failed. The adoption, small as it was, grounded a new kind of family, not one defined by blood, but by the deliberate decision to care. Life after that adoption was not cinematic in the way tabloids might have imagined. There were dinners with awkward silences and domestic protocols to be invented. Alexander learned to eat soup without glancing at the watch. Camila learned to accept flowers with a cool reserve. Mateus, a bright child with a mouth perpetually smudged in graphite, took to Alexander the way children latch onto adults who will listen. He drew enormous dinosaurs and left them on the coffee table as if to stake a claim. Alexander would unfold those drawings and study every exaggerated tooth, every spiky tail, and feel for the first time a simple joy that had no strategic value. He spent afternoons in public parks where he once might have held meetings. He bought a second-hand kite and stumbled through the basic physics of letting it find the air. These were not grand sacrifices. They were small and clumsy rewiring of priorities. He learned the cadence of presence, the simple habit of asking, "How was your day?" and actually staying to hear the answer. That practice, more than anything else, began to rewrite him. Time, however, is a brittle thing. Years after the initial collapse and the subsequent reforms, Alexander's health began to wobble again. It was not dramatic, the kind of instantaneous crisis that collapses a city's attention, but a succession of small losses that cumulatively weakened him. He knew the counts of doctors and specialists. He knew probabilities and prognoses in a way that had once made him formidable. Now that knowledge brought with it a different kind of fear. He had built a life of contingency plans for companies and portfolios. He had few prepared answers for how to hand over his own unfinishedness. The relapse came on a Thursday, a stitch of fever, a lab result that suggested fragile balance, and then the world narrowing to the thin vertical of hospital light. He was conscious, but not all there, lucid and hazy in the same breath, the mind of a man who had spent a life making decisions suddenly wanting only a few simple truths to be held by someone he trusted. In the muted hum of the intensive care room, with the city breathing beyond the glass, Alexander asked Camila to pull her chair near. He had letters written, sealed and signed, practical instructions in his accountant's shorthand. He had plans for corporate transitions. Those were the things that would happen whether or not he spoke. The thing he needed from her now was not in a ledger. He wanted to be sure that the movement he had started, tough, small, human, would be more than the ego of a man who could pay bills. He wanted it to live. He placed a trembling hand on hers and looked at her with a gravity that unmade him. "Camila," he said, and the name rose like a benediction. "There's a fund we started, the Community Trust. It's in the company's books, but it needs a keeper who will remind people why it exists. I don't want it to become another line on a balance sheet." She held his gaze. In his face, she saw the traces of the man who once measured everything in margins and outputs, but she also saw the man who had spent years trying to unlearn that habit. He continued, voice a thread. "Promise me you'll keep it in the hands that need it, not for our image, not for our tax breaks, but for the people who live in the blocks and build our structures. Make sure they are on the board. Make sure the trustees are chosen by the people themselves. Keep them visible, keep them paid." This was his request, stewardship. It was practical, specific, and rooted in the malformed thing he had once failed to notice, human life under corporate systems. He did not ask her to save him. He did not ask for forgiveness like a command. He asked to be trusted with what he had started. Camila's response was not immediate. She had learned over the years how to hold anger and grief and hope at once, without letting any swallow the other. She could feel the weight of history in his voice, and yet she knew that trust demanded more than acceptance. It demanded accountability. She leaned close, her own voice steady with the blunt truth she had come to be known for. "I will do it," she said. "But I will do it on terms that put the people first. No more backrooms. The trustees will be people who live here. The money will be audited by community boards. You built something that hurt people who loved and worked. We will try to repair it, not hide what happened." There was a pause, as if both of them were listening to the future adjust its shape. Alexander gave a gentle nod and closed his eyes. There was something like a blessing in that nod. A permission to proceed, an admission that he could not finish the work alone. "Keep their names," he whispered suddenly. "Tell their stories. Don't let them become a footnote. Roberto's name, keep it alive." That second clause mirrored the moral charge he had been circling since he read the file years ago. It was not a theatrical demand to immortalize a guilt. It was a plea for memory as a tool of responsibility. Camila accepted this too, though she insisted later on contextualizing those stories with the agency of the families involved. She would not allow anyone to exploit grief for publicity, but neither would she permit erasure. The doctors were careful and clinical, but they could not soothe the human calculus at work. The relapse was serious. No miracles were promised. What mattered were the acts that turned a private moment into a public responsibility. Alexander's last weeks were filled with signatures and directives that were not just about money, but about structures. The community trust was to be governed by a board, half elected by neighborhood committees, half appointed to ensure institutional continuity. Pensions were to be escalated for families affected by past incidents. An independent safety office received funding to audit sites, report publicly, and have actionable power. These were not final absolutions, they were scaffolding for a process. Leadership changes provoked turmoil. The board argued about share prices and reputational risk. Marlene, his mother, felt bereft at the public humility he displayed. Raphael accused him of squandering a legacy built by their father. Camila, newly given legal authority and the moral weight of the adoption, stood in the middle of these fights with a surprising resilience. She did not play power games, she negotiated terms. Her insistence on transparent trustees and community oversight was received with eye rolls by some and gratitude by others. The fights were necessary. They were the rough work of making change stick. Zelia, who had once been the quiet epicenter of a private loss, began slowly to see the effects of what Alexander had set into motion. The pension checks came, regular and steady, not grand gestures that required ministerial press conferences, but small, dignified sustenance, help for the children's school, a roof repair, a contribution to a medical fund. Mateus's school desk no longer grew skinnier with the weight of under-resourced notebooks. He bought a new backpack that did not look like something patched together from old shopping bags. The dignity was in the ordinary things. It was in the absence of charity's glare and the presence of a quiet recognition. After Alexander's last hospital vigil, there was an ending that was neither cinematic nor tidy. He did not die with an epiphany. He did not redeem himself in a single, sweeping gesture. He had been repaired in small increments, with real consequences and real resistance. His last coherent days were spent reading letters he had written, apologies, directives, and personal notes that he wanted to leave in well-labeled envelopes. He slipped a folded page into Camilla's palm once, his handwriting a shaky script that said simply, "Keep them seen." She became the keeper of more than fund documents. She kept the stories that named people and their lives. She insisted on community town halls, where families had a say in how money was spent. She organized trusteeship schools, so individuals from working neighborhoods could learn financial literacy and governance. Alexander's directives were not slavish law in her hands, but starting points for genuine participation. She championed hiring from the communities affected by construction projects and set up a small workers' safety bureau with the power to pause construction until conditions met standards she helped draft. The changes rippled. A small community center that had been promised for years opened with kids inside doing science experiments under dim but eager lights. Mateus was there among them, chalk smudged on his sleeve, proud to point out a diagram he'd drawn of a volcano. He had the kind of easy, bright joy that makes adults try to be better. Alexander had spent late hours once trying to teach him the rules of the stock market, not because the child needed them, but because the man wanted to show there are ways of thinking that were not only for the wealthy. Now, the lessons were about how to build safely, how to organize, how to tell one's story without fear. Not everyone believed the changes would last. Cynicism is a durable thing. Some former executives quietly resisted new audits. Some shareholders grumbled that the company's margins were under pressure. But the board structure, the transparency, the community trusteeship created friction against old habits. The reforms did not eliminate inequality overnight, nor did they absolve Alexander entirely. What they did was create channels that made the repetition of previous harms more difficult. Camila, in the quieter afternoons, kept a small drawer where she placed things that tethered her to the before times and the now. There was a photograph of her mother with a mop in hand, smiling because dignity had come into view, a child's drawing of a dinosaur with teeth large as hope, and a folded note from Alexander faded at the creases, with one line he had scribbled before his last sedation: "Make sure the invisible are visible." There was, too, the question of what it meant to be family after a man like Alexander was gone. The legal papers had made Camila his daughter on paper, but her identity had been formed long before in hospital nights, in the shared labor of making a program honest, in stubborn arguments about how to honor the people whose lives had been touched by the company. Grief, when it came, was a quiet thing that lived in the weight of a too-heavy coffee cup and in the empty place at a dining table set for someone who would not return to it. The aftermath was work. The fund needed trustees. The community center needed staff. The pensions had to be reconciled with changing tax rules. Every bureaucratic knot they untied was a small act of remembrance. When the first public report of the Trust's governance structure was published, it featured testimonies from people who had once been invisible on timesheets. A woman who had cleaned the site where Roberto died spoke at the meeting and read a short statement. She did not seek vengeance. She sought truth and stability. She thanked the trustees for the pension checks and for the safety audits that had saved a cousin from what could have been a similar fate. The small, particular gratitude in the room made the debates on the board recede into their rightful place, necessary but not the only center of concern. Camila did not wield her new authority like a weapon. She used it like a scalpel, precise, careful, and sometimes uncomfortable for those who had grown used to seeing money as a blunt lever. She made mistakes. She overcommitted funds in a moment of trust that was later abused by a supplier. She learned to retract and to admit the error publicly. Her hardest lessons were not structural. They were about how to hold people's stories without letting pity blind her to their dignity. She fought to keep the fund engaged in long-term education programs rather than one-off payouts. She insisted the company's philanthropic arm publish audits that could be read by anyone, and that trustees come from neighborhoods that were most impacted by the company's projects. Mateus grew taller. He learned to play football and made a friend whose father worked in scaffolding. The boy with whom he traded stickers carried with him a family history that was less precarious than before. That kind of ordinary flourishing is often invisible because it does not make headlines, but it is real. A child who no longer worries about school fees can learn to imagine futures that do not end at a job site. Months later, at a small remembrance for people who had helped start the trust, Camila found herself reading from a list of names and the dates of their deaths. She spoke plainly, with the quiet precision she used when arguing for budgets, and made a pledge she intended to keep. This is not a museum where we store guilt. This is a living thing. We will teach safety. We will fund school books. We will make sure their children learn the trades with dignity, with paid apprenticeships and health coverage. And we will make sure their names are spoken. When the board of the company asked for a written history of the trust's setup for their annual report, she declined the press release tone. Instead, she wrote a short account in which she quoted Roberto's sister and explained the human logic behind each program. She closed it with a line Alexander had said to her in the hospital and which she kept like a small talisman. Make sure the invisible are visible. There were no fireworks when the reforms began to take shape. The company's stock dipped and rose. Life continued in the ordinary ways it always does. But inside the neighborhoods touched by the projects, the world felt, if not transformed, then at least slightly less precarious. A modest classroom, where Mateus learned to solder microcircuits, was one small sign. An older woman who had kept listless by the hospital bed now attended town hall meetings and spoke up when she saw a safety concern. Dignity had many small faces. Camila kept the note Alexander had folded into her palm during his last lucid hours. Keep them seen. In a wallet she carried in her bag. It was not a relic of sorrow, but a compass. She used it when budgets were tight and when proposals tempted the trustees to take the easy public relations route. She used it when contractors attempted to cut corners, and the safety team under the trust's funding refused. She used it on days when grief threatened to make her small and private promises seem cold and far away. Once, in a moment of private reckoning, she sat with Zelia on the worn sofa in a small apartment that smelled of lemon and saffron. The two women, one with hands hardened by scrubbing floors and the other with hands softened by needles and bandages, spoke without grand gestures. "Did you ever imagine this?" Zelia asked, looking at Mateus colouring at the table, his tongue sticking out in concentration. Camila smiled, the expression that had become familiar, humble and resistant to sentimentality. "No," she said, "but I did imagine listening. That's enough." To anyone watching, the life that followed was quiet, but inexorable. The Trust's annual report included budgets and measurable outcomes, but the fine print of the change was the way a neighbourhood's bus routes felt safer, the way a single mother could enroll in an evening course funded by the Trust without worrying that overtime would vanish, the way Mateus no longer had to patch a backpack before school. This was the kind of legacy Alexander had begged her, in the end, to guard. Not the plaque with his name on it, not the towers that reflected sunlight into other people's windows, but an ongoing attention to who was seen and who was not. "Promise me," he had said once more, very faintly, as if rehearsing one last piece of courage. "Promise me you'll keep them visible." She had promised. Sometimes promises are the simplest contracts a person can keep. She did not do it alone. Other people, Zelia, neighbours, new trustees who had once been labourers, joined the work. The structure Alexander created had become, in a small and stubborn way, something that outlived him precisely because it required community to sustain it. Years later, there was a drawer Camila opened on rainy afternoons where she kept small objects from the life she had been given. A clinic stamp, a child's drawing of a dinosaur whose back was riddled with triangular mountains, a note from Alexander in a handwriting that had finally loosened into a scrawl. When she pulled the papers out, she often smiled at the imperfections, the ink smudges, the folded corners, proofs of a life that had been touched, marred, and rebuilt. She never sought to be a savior. That had never been what she wanted. Her adoption had been legal and binding, yes, but more important had been the slow, mutual work of trust and accountability. She continued to nurse people in the literal sense, patients with fevers and broken bones, and to nurse the larger wounds that institutions inflict, inertia, neglect, and erasure. The community trust carried a name that was not his alone. At meetings, the trustees often used phrases he might have spoken. More often they spoke the language of the neighbourhoods they served. On a late afternoon, long after the machines had quieted for Alexander, Camila found herself at a simple table in the community centre, watching Mateus show a small group of kids how to solder a simple circuit board. He explained, with the confidence of someone who had been taught by people who believed in him, how electricity could travel in a path made by careful hands. It was a domestic miracle, not dramatic, not easy to monetize, but profound in its ordinary persistence. A child who once feared school fees now described, unabashed, how he wanted to build things. Camila kept a small object in her pocket that day, a folded piece of paper with a dinosaur and Alexander's scrawl in the corner. She felt grief sometimes, of course, the ache of missed conversations at an empty chair at a holiday table. But she also felt a steady, quiet satisfaction that the promise he had asked for had been turned into practice. In public, the company continued to do what companies do, build, hire, and account. But in the margins, the work of making people visible changed a few things that mattered. Workers who once felt invisible found seats at tables. Schoolchildren who had once been given hand-me-downs now received apprenticeships and scholarships. A woman named Zelia, who had once cleaned floors and kept secrets in her silence, found herself telling her neighbours how she had watched a child, Mateus, grow into someone who no longer feared the future. Camila often returned to the small phrase that had shifted the arc of their lives. Make sure the invisible are visible. It was not Alexander's alone now. It was a task she took up, imperfectly and persistently. She taught other people to take it up too. In the end, the most private request of a dying billionaire had become a public ethic, that no person be simply a line item in someone else's ledger. If this story moved you, share it with someone who might need a reminder that change can be quiet and that real repair is built slowly by people who choose to see one another. And if you have a story of someone who made an invisible life visible, tell it below. Sometimes the smallest stories teach the largest truths.